Sometimes, no matter what you do, things just don't go your way. For example, you might be incredibly well qualified for that new job, but you lose the position to the boss's friend. It stinks, but sometimes things are just out of your hands. You'd be hard-pressed to find a country whose history was more out of its citizens' hands than Czechoslovakia. Indeed, from German occupation to eventual dissolution, neither the bulk of the Czech or Slovak populations ever had a significant voice in the biggest events of the nation. Prior to the beginning of World War II, Czechoslovakia was annexed by Germany. It was agreed to in Munich by the leading European powers of the day in the hopes that granting Germany this territory, which they wanted due to the large German population in the Sudetenland, would placate German imperialism, avoiding conflict and ending future aggression. The Czechoslovakian government was not privy to the negotiations, and as a result has since referred to the agreement as the Munich Betrayal. After Germany took possession of Czechoslovakia in 1938, its president, Edvard Beneš, resigned. He soon set up a Czechoslovakian government in exile in France, and moved it to London after the German invasion of France. During the war, German occupation grew increasingly strict in Czechoslovakia, and politicians that had remained or activists who stirred up trouble were routinely arrested by German police and the Gestapo. As the war progressed and the Holocaust increased in intensity, Czech and Slovak Jews were deported, and areas of Czechoslovakian cities were transformed into Jewish ghettos. After the defeat of Germany in World War II, Beneš returned triumphantly to Prague in 1945, where the Republican Czechoslovakian government was restored. The harsh treatment of Czechs and Slovaks by the German occupiers was not forgotten. Soon after the restoration of Czechoslovakia, Beneš's government began deporting any Germans remaining in Czechoslovakia, especially those living in the Sudetenland. In all, 1.7 million Germans were deported to the American occupation zone in West Germany, and an additional 750,000 were deported to Soviet-controlled East Germany. Additionally, the land and companies of any Nazi collaborators were confiscated and nationalized. Unfortunately for the Czechoslovakian Republic, the country fell firmly within the sphere of influence the United Kingdom and the United States had agreed to grant the Soviet Union. When the Czechoslovakian Republic made moves to begin accepting Marshall Plan aid and better relations with the West, the Czechoslovakian Communist Party, or KSC, began stirring up trouble at Moscow's behest. As a result, the KSC began using its control of the Ministry of the Interior to purge the police and security forces of non-communists. In the first few months of 1948, the KSC used its control of the police and security forces to take control and occupy key ministries and posts of the Czechoslovakian government. Before long, non-communist government officials were denied speaking time on any major Czechoslovak radio or television network. On February 25, 1948, Beneš resigned the presidency, fearing that any resistance from his Republican allies would lead to a Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. He died later that year, having seen his dreams of a democratic Republican Czechoslovakia crushed twice in his lifetime. Soon after the KSC took control of the Czechoslovakian government, they began implementing Marxist principles and strengthening their already close ties with the Soviet government in Moscow. Most sectors of the economy and society were brought under state control. All heavy industry was nationalized, and all schools were controlled by the government. Furthermore, the government was purged of any remaining democratic officials. Even within the KSC itself, purges occurred, as any communist not sufficiently radical for Stalin's and Moscow's liking found themselves arrested. Czechoslovakia was soon integrated into the Soviet economy and was tightly controlled by Moscow, regardless of technically remaining a separate state. In the 1950s, communist Czechoslovakia rapidly expanded its heavy industry, as dictated by Moscow. By the 1960s, however, the Czechoslovakian economy had slowed, and some within Czechoslovak communist circles began clamoring for change. The Moscow-preferred communist leader was deposed in 1968. In his place, Alexander Dubček, a moderate communist reformer, took the presidency. Dubček relaxed some of the stricter communist measures in the Czechoslovakian economy, hoping to encourage growth, and he removed the censorship of the press. This led to mass demonstrations against communism across Czechoslovakia. These developments alarmed the Soviet Union, who feared the failure of communism in Czechoslovakia could lead to rebellions elsewhere in communist Eastern Europe. As a result, Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev ordered Soviet troops into Czechoslovakia. Soviet forces rolled through the country largely unopposed, taking control of most major cities in a matter of days. Soon after, Dubček was forced to resign, and a more communist-friendly regime was installed at the head of the Czechoslovakian government. Only 2 decades later, the Soviet economy was floundering, and Mikhail Gorbachev ironically instituted some of the very same reforms the Czechoslovakians had attempted in 1968. As the Soviet Union's tight grip over Eastern Europe began to falter, anti-communist protests and demonstrations broke out across the region, including in Czechoslovakia. The anti-communist movement in Czechoslovakia was largely led by students and other members of the educated public. Many historians have contributed the students' fervency to being too young to remember 1968, and therefore unafraid of possible Soviet reprisals. Václav Havel, a former playwright, emerged as leader of the opposition in the streets of Prague. In 1989, only days after the Berlin Wall fell in Germany, the communist government of Czechoslovakia quietly and bloodlessly handed over the reins of government to Havel, which has become known as the Velvet Revolution due to the peaceful regime change. The fall of communism was not the final momentous event in the history of Czechoslovakia. Indeed, before the end of the millennium, Czechoslovakia itself would cease to exist. The two regions of the country were different ethnically and economically, the western half inhabited mainly by ethnic Czechs and far richer, as opposed to the eastern half, which was poorer and inhabited mainly by ethnic Slovaks. Soon after the Velvet Revolution, Slovakian nationalists formed the Slovakian Nationalist Party, and pushed for further decentralization from Prague. Despite the wishes of its politicians, the majority of both Czechs and Slovaks did not wish for the country to split. Regardless, the government pushed through with several resolutions in late 1992 at the behest of the Separatist Party, and on January 1, 1993, Czechoslovakia dissolved, becoming the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The history of Czechoslovakia after World War II was largely out of the hands of either Czechs or Slovaks. German hegemony over Czechoslovakia was virtually given to Germany by the United Kingdom and France, and after the war, Czechoslovakia's short-lived republic under Edvard Beneš was doomed due to the United States and the United Kingdom agreeing to give the Soviet Union influence over the Eastern European state. When the Soviet Union fell in the late 1980s, Czechoslovakia was finally free of foreign influence, only to be dissolved at the behest of a small but vocal separatist party in 1993.